Hello and welcome to the program. Today, dozens of Ukrainian citizens are illegally imprisoned by Russia on political motives. Now, just recently, a roundtable called Legislative Regulation of the Protection of Ukrainian Political Hostages and Prisoners has been held in Kyiv. To get a clearer view on this issue, we welcome to the studio today Lesia Vasylenko. She's the chairperson of the Legal 100 NGO. Hello and thank you for joining us.
Hello, thank you.
So first question, let's talk about this event in particular. So the purpose of the event was to discuss issues of social protection of hostages and searching for the optimal solutions to protect them and then release them. What are the key messages that you can outline from this event?
This event was targeted at actually giving a definition of the people who are illegally held imprisoned in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and also in the territory of the aggressor state, the Russian Federation. So at this point in time, there's a mix-up in the definitions, whereby people are often called hostages or political prisoners or prisoners of war or imprisoned, etc., etc. But we are actually talking about different categories. So we have our prisoners of war, and these are all the soldiers who have been held by Russian or para-Russian military forces. These are combatants, and they are eligible for the status of prisoners of war. It's a status which is envisaged by international law, by the Geneva Conventions in particular. And when a person holds the status of prisoner of war, he or she is eligible for a certain degree of protection by international law. And the other party, the one which is holding these persons as prisoners, is also under obligation to abide by certain rules and to protect their rights as prisoners of war. It's a different regime of the way that these people are to be held prisoners. It's a different regime as to what these people can and cannot do in this status. Ukraine respects the provisions of the public international law and of the humanitarian law with regards to Russians who are taken as prisoners of war. Russia doesn't,
I can imagine.
And this is one point. So this needs to be also clearly enshrined in the legislation of Ukraine, so that the families of the people who are held of the soldiers who are held as prisoners of war can get the necessary support from the government of Ukraine, first of all, and second of all, so that in further development of the case, that these people have a basis to actually appeal to the Russian government for compensation.
But that means that, if I may, if Russia admits that they are prisoners of war, indeed Russia admits that it's involved in a conflict in eastern Ukraine, in some sort of implicit thing here. So it's kind of a paradoxical.
It's a long kind of story, and which should have been admitted a long time ago. So this is one side of the story. The other side of the story is the civilians who are also illegally held in places of imprisonment in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. So these civilians, they're, so to speak, hostages, and their status also needs to be clearly defined. And the support which can be provided to them once they are returned to their families and to their homes also needs to be provided in the legislation directly and clearly. Third group is the political prisoners. These are persons who have been imprisoned either in the territory of Russian Federation or in the territory of the temporarily occupied territories by the Russian Federation. And this category is, for example, persons who have been imprisoned clearly for their political views, for the expression of their political opinions, etc., etc. And there's a large number of these people as well. And once again, their status links up to a certain degree of protection which can be provided.
So that's for the treatment, as you said, and the protection. But what about the release? Are there, for the prisoners of war, political prisoners of, as you said, hostages, different processes of release here and different channel of release and exchanges?
The release and exchange, it's in fact not a matter of national legislation in Ukraine, but it's a matter of discussion for a bilateral treaty or perhaps even multilateral treaty, but at the moment we are hoping for a bilateral one between Ukraine and Russia. This is a topic of discussion often during the Minsk talks, although there are certain actors who are saying that it's not a topic of discussion and the Minsk talks should be about something else. But this is a perfect platform where to discuss
because that's the moment where everybody's around the table.
Exactly, and it's a moment where it can be an open discussion and where conditions can be presented and agreed upon. Unfortunately, there is a reluctance again from the Russian Federation, as you said, they are reluctant to admit their participation whatsoever, although it seems that it's clear to all of the civilized world that they are the aggressor state and that they are actively involved in occupying large territories of Ukraine, and they are actually committing acts of aggression towards the whole of Ukraine. But their stance is that they have nothing to do with it, and this is what makes this negotiation about the returning of those held illegally in captivity a problem. And this is what makes it a problem also about the return of our prisoners of war, of the sailors who have
of the Kerch Straits.
Of the Kerch Straits.
Do you think that there's a way, say, legal or economical, I don't know, to make Russia at least comply, if not admit its involvement in the conflict, but comply with that kind of exchange? We saw some exchanges and some exchange for certain prisoners recently. How did it work, and like before, and how can it work, and can it work again like that?
There has been hope that before the presidential election there may be another sort of wave of release or of exchange. However, nothing of the sort happened, and it is probably that Putin has said on a number of occasions that he has no intention to negotiate any questions with the current government, and he's waiting for a change of government so that he can continue his discussions and negotiations or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's not about the negotiations with a certain government. It's about people who are being held hostages and who are being held as prisoners of war by the Russian side. This is for Ukraine. And Russia, on their side, it turns out that they don't care about the people who are being retained in Ukraine, and they're prisoners of war. So those people have been basically abandoned by their government, and the Russian government is sort of saying, we don't care, because for us it's a political game that we are playing.
So you wouldn't see it as some sort of a, this release being played as sort of like pawns into the narrative of Putin, saying to the international community, right, I'm going to release these prisoners because, I'm magnanimous and stuff like that. You wouldn't see it happening?
I think that the pawns in this game are actually the Russian military, which are at this moment held in Ukraine as prisoners of war. And Putin is playing with his own people, and he is treating them as pawns. And this is not the only example. The Ukrainian soldiers and also the Ukrainians who are held illegally in captivity by the Russians, that's a different story. There is a large willpower and a large negotiations potential of the Ukrainian government to keep doing what they're doing. This roundtable today was not concerned with the matter of political negotiations about the return of the political prisoners, of the prisoners of war, of the hostages. It was concerned about the Ukrainian government defining clearly a status for each category, and also providing support to the families of those who wait. Because unfortunately there are cases where wives and mothers have been waiting for 4 years, for 3 years, and they do not know for how much longer they will wait. They use a lot of their own resources to seek legal aid. They use a lot of their own resources to continue providing humanitarian aid to their loved ones who are held in captivity. And it's up to for the government to step up and provide the support on a systemic basis, because up till now there has been support, but it's more of like a one
case by case
basis, and it was also more from like private funds of different prominent personalities in Ukraine, but it's about actually placing it on a systemic level. And once Ukraine does it, when Ukraine recognizes the status of these people and the fact that the families and these people, when they come back, that they are eligible for support, it's also sending a strong message to the outside world and to Russia as well.
Which brings me to my next question.
We know that you are holding our soldiers as prisoners of war, and we clearly stated in our acts of legislation. We know about the political prisoners, and we are doing everything to support. And it's also another message to the people who are held in captivity legally by Russia, that Ukrainian government is providing support to the families and will be providing support to them when they come back.
It's not a domestic policy, but it's also like
an international message.
Establish a framework to work on that on the international policy. Now, there has been this event. Let's talk a little bit more about your NGO. What's next? So there has been this roundtable. What's next for your NGO, and what's the next step?
The Legal 100 works in many different directions in terms of policy shaping with regard to veterans and veterans affairs. We also work with the families of the veterans. So at this moment, we are involved in a rather big project for Ukraine on the reform of the law of the status of veterans and of the system of service provision by the government to the veterans. It will be a major piece of legislation, and probably not just one, but several, which will finally give a clear definition of who is a veteran in Ukraine. And what we are trying to do is we're trying to separate civilians who have, for example, lived in a place of combat or a place of conflict, or civilians who have contributed to war efforts, from actual people who have, from soldiers who have taken up weapons and who are considered under international law as combatants, and also from those men and women who serve in the military or in the defense and security bodies in Ukraine. We are trying to separate the two categories out. The civilians, they will still be eligible for certain support and for certain statuses, but it definitely cannot be the same as that of veterans. And the position of the Legal 100 and my own position is that the civilians will need to be defined in separate acts of legislation, and veterans will have their own separate act of legislation, because at the moment there is a kind of confusion and a mix-up. And when we speak about 1.6 million veterans in Ukraine,
it's actually
some of this number is actually civilians who are given veteran status. For example, we have this term as participant of war,
which is quite vague. But and now to conclude this interview, Ukraine is at a turning point now. On March 31st, there's going to be the election. How to ensure, and how does your NGO ensure that sort of, as you said, continuity and the sort of fight for having a clear legal view, despite whoever is elected? What range of maneuvers do you plan to have after that, and how to ensure that these efforts continue?
It's very difficult to actually make any kinds of forecasts, but up till now we have been a non-partisan NGO, meaning that we are basically working with all the different kinds of political forces in parliament and in government, regardless of their party affiliation, as long as they have similar to our own view of the strategy towards veterans. So I guess that having the end goal in mind and playing towards a beneficial system of veteran care in Ukraine, regardless of who becomes president, I believe that the issue of veterans is a part of the issue of national defense and security. And it's definitely the priority of the presidential branch of government. So I guess that we will find a kind of common ground to further these issues and find the most effective solution for Ukraine and Ukraine's veterans.
Well, thank you for your overview on this issue. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio today.
Thank you.
That was Lesia Vasylenko, chairperson of the Legal 100 NGO. Thank you for watching the program, and stay tuned for the rest.